World War I was a brutal proving ground for armoured warfare, and no battlefield tested the limits of early tanks quite like Passchendaele. Officially known as the Third Battle of Ypres, this infamous campaign became a nightmarish struggle against not just the German war machine, but the very earth itself. Weeks of relentless rain turned the battlefield into an ocean of thick, clinging mud, swallowing soldiers, wrecking supply lines and grinding the advance of tanks to a near halt. Designed to break the deadlock of trench warfare, these early armoured beasts faced an enemy they were not built to defeat, the very terrain beneath them. But for one tank crew, the nightmare was just beginning. Isolated and immobilised in the heart of no man's land, these men were stranded for 3 harrowing days, exposed to enemy fire, struggling for survival and forced to make a desperate decision that would test the very limits of their endurance. How did they get trapped? How did they survive? And what does their story reveal about the grim reality of World War I tank warfare? Stay tuned as we dive into one of the most incredible tank survival stories of the Great War. By the summer of 1917, the British Army had embraced a revolutionary new weapon, the tank. These steel beasts were designed to break through the endless lines of barbed wire, withstand machine gun fire, and push forward where infantry alone could not. And among them was one particular Mark IV tank that would etch its name into military history, Fray Bentos. This particular tank was commanded by Captain Donald Richardson, a man whose journey to the battlefields of the Western Front was anything but ordinary. Before the war, Richardson wasn't a hardened soldier. He was working in his family's grocery store in Nottingham, selling goods to local customers. But when war broke out in 1914, like so many of his generation, he didn't hesitate. He enlisted with the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment, better known as the Sherwood Foresters. And by 1915, he was thrust into the grim reality of trench warfare on the Western Front. Richardson quickly proved himself in combat, and as the war evolved, so did his role. When the British began deploying tanks as a game-changing force on the battlefield, he was promoted to captain and given command of his own crew. He named his Mark IV tank Fray Bentos after the brand of canned meat his family sold, a name that would soon be remembered for far more than just rations on the front. The Mark IV, introduced in May 1917, was a formidable machine. It was the first British tank to be mass-produced and widely deployed in battle, proving to be a major asset against entrenched German forces. Equipped with ordnance, QF 6-pounder guns and Lewis Point 303-inch machine guns, it could lay down devastating firepower against enemy positions, supporting infantry advances in ways never before seen in warfare. But despite its strength, the Mark IV had its weaknesses. Slow, mechanically unreliable, and highly vulnerable to becoming trapped in mud-filled craters, it was far from invincible. Richardson wasn't alone in his command of Fray Bentos. He led a 9-man crew, each of whom played a critical role in operating the behemoth. Together, these men formed a tight-knit team trained to endure the extreme conditions of tank warfare, but what they were about to experience would test them beyond anything they had imagined. Fray Bentos was about to roll into one of the most grueling and extraordinary survival stories of the First World War, a tale of courage, resilience, and sheer determination in the face of impossible odds. By the summer of 1917, the Western Front had become a hellish landscape of mud, barbed wire, and unrelenting artillery fire. The British High Command sought to break the deadlock with a new offensive, one that would become infamous. The Battle of Passchendaele began on July 31st, 1917, with British and French forces launching an all-out assault against well-entrenched German positions near the Belgian town of Ypres. For over 3 grueling months, men fought and died in conditions so horrific that even hardened veterans described it as worse than anything they had previously endured. The battlefield, churned up by relentless artillery bombardments and weeks of torrential rain, became a quagmire of liquid mud where soldiers drowned in flooded shell craters, weapons jammed from the filth, and any semblance of strategy was swallowed whole by the unforgiving terrain. It was into this nightmarish battlefield that Fray Bentos and her crew advanced on August 22nd, 1917, tasked with supporting the 61st Division in their attack near St. Julian. At 4 a.m, the Mark IV tank lurched forward into no man's land, its engine roaring through the pre-dawn darkness and its steel hull promising protection against the machine guns and artillery waiting ahead. Donald Richardson chose to walk alongside the tanks, guiding its movement as the assault began. But almost immediately the enemy struck.
German machine guns from Somme Farm opened fire, sending a hail of bullets toward the advancing British forces. The Fray Bentos crew wasted no time in retaliating. Their 6-pounder guns and Lewis machine guns roared to life, shredding the German position and silencing the enemy guns. But the battle was far from over.
As the Mark IV pushed toward its next objective, an enemy position ominously named Gallipoli, it came under even heavier fire. The Germans had seen what tanks could do, and they were determined to stop this one. Bullets tore through the air, clanging off the tank's armour and seeking any weak points.
Then came a devastating blow.
Richardson was hit. A bullet ripped into his leg, forcing him to abandon his position outside and crawl inside the tank for cover. George Hill fared no better. A shot to the neck sent him tumbling from his seat, his vision blurring as he fought to remain conscious. At that very moment, Fray Bentos hit disaster. The heavy tank, already straining to move through the rain-soaked battlefield, lurched into a deep patch of mud and toppled sideways into a waterlogged ditch. The mechanical monster was now immobilized, becoming a sitting target in the middle of no man's land. With their vehicle stuck, the crew knew they had to act fast. Robert Missin and Hans Brady sprang into action, climbing out of the tank to deploy its unditching gear, the last hope of freeing Fray Bentos before the Germans could bring in artillery to finish them off. But the enemy was waiting. The moment they stepped into the open, a fresh wave of German gunfire erupted from the mist, cutting down the exposed men. The crew inside the tank fired back, their Lewis guns spewing bullets in every direction, trying to suppress the enemy long enough for their comrades to make it back inside. But Brady never made it. A German bullet found its mark and he fell, vanishing into the mud. His body was swallowed by the quagmire, never to be recovered. Inside Fray Bentos, the situation grew even more desperate. By 7 a.m, the British infantry attack had stalled, and the soldiers who had been pushing forward now began retreating back to their trenches, leaving the tank and its crew completely alone. The Germans saw their chance. Enemy troops closed in, swarming toward the immobilized tank, but the crew of Fray Bentos wasn't giving up without a fight. With their Lewis guns still operational, they cut down wave after wave of attackers, filling no man's land with spent shell casings as they desperately tried to hold their position. But they were running out of time. The Germans weren't just trying to destroy the tank from the outside, they were now engaging the crew in close quarters combat. And as the battle raged on, the men inside Fray Bentos realized a chilling truth. One by one, they were all getting wounded. The crew of Fray Bentos had been through hell. Trapped in no man's land, wounded, outnumbered and isolated, they had defied the odds, for hours repelling wave after wave of German attacks. But as the sun set on August 22nd, 1917, the battle was far from over. The men inside the tank now faced a nightmare beyond combat, a grueling 3-day siege where survival depended not only on their firepower, but on their sheer will to live. With no reinforcements coming and their tank permanently stuck in the mud, the crew had no choice but to hold their ground. The Germans kept coming, attempting to storm the tank under the cover of darkness. From inside the iron fortress, the men of Fray Bentos fired relentlessly, driving them back with bursts of machine gun fire. The smell of spent gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the metallic sting of blood and the acrid stench of burning oil from the damaged vehicle. As if their situation wasn't already dire, an unexpected new threat emerged from the very side they were fighting for. British snipers, positioned in the trenches behind them, began taking shots at the tank. They had mistaken Fray Bentos for a captured Mark IV being used by the Germans, a devastating misidentification that now placed the already battered crew under friendly fire. Something had to be done. Robert Missin stepped forward. Though wounded, he volunteered to crawl back through no man's land, alone, dodging both German machine gunners and British sniper fire to reach the trenches. He moved inch by inch through the mud, each breath laboured, knowing that one wrong move would mean certain death. After what must have felt like an eternity, Missin reached the British lines and managed to communicate their true identity. The sniper fire ceased, but the battle for survival was far from over. With their food and water supplies gone, the men inside Fray Bentos were now battling dehydration and exhaustion just as much as the enemy. They turned to the only liquid available, the filthy oil-tinged water drained from the tank's radiator. It was barely drinkable, but in a battlefield where men drowned in the very mud they fought on, survival demanded desperate measures. 3 days had passed. The men inside Fray Bentos were bleeding, starving and barely clinging to consciousness, yet they had held off the enemy for 60 grueling hours, a feat almost unheard of in World War I tank warfare. Donald Richardson knew that time had run out. If they didn't escape now, they never would. At 9 p.m. on August 24, 1917, under the cover of darkness, he gave the order: abandon the tank. But they wouldn't leave Fray Bentos behind without ensuring it never fell into enemy hands. The crew dismantled the tank's 6-pounder cannons, removed all their maps, weapons and classified documents, and prepared for one final test of endurance: the crawl back to British lines. Wounded, weak and exhausted, the remaining 7 men began their agonizing escape. They couldn't risk standing, as any movement could attract German snipers, so they were forced to crawl inch by inch through the mud, dragging their battered bodies over barbed wire and through shell craters filled with the remains of fallen soldiers. Every sound, every movement could mean death. For hours they pushed forward. Every breath was a struggle, every wound screaming in pain, but the promise of survival kept them moving. At last they saw them, British trenches just ahead, and waiting for them was a unit of the 9th Battalion, the Black Watch, the legendary Scottish regiment. The soldiers, stunned at the sight of these battered, mud-covered survivors, lowered their rifles as the Fray Bentos crew approached. The men who had fought for 3 days against impossible odds surrendered their weapons and were swiftly escorted to the aid station, where medics worked desperately to treat their wounds. They had survived. The Fray Bentos crew had endured one of the longest and most intense tank engagements of the First World War. 9 men had gone into battle, and despite being trapped for 3 days in one of the most hellish battlefields in history, 7 had made it out alive. Their extraordinary courage and refusal to surrender under relentless enemy fire turned Fray Bentos into a legend, a testament to the resilience of the first generation of tank crews.
Their actions did not go unnoticed. The British Army recognised their bravery with some of the highest honours awarded to tank crews during the war. Donald Richardson was mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Military Cross. He returned to the fight with a new tank, Fray Bentos II, and continued serving until the war's bitter end. George Hill, who'd fought on despite his injuries, also received the Military Cross, recognising his exceptional leadership under fire. Robert Missin and William Morrie, whose bravery helped keep the crew alive, were awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, an honour given for acts of heroism on the battlefield. The remaining surviving gunners who'd fought tooth and nail to hold off enemy forces were presented with the Military Medal. Only one man wouldn't live to see the end of the war. Percy Budd, who'd survived the siege of Fray Bentos, was tragically killed almost exactly a year later, on August 25, 1918. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, marking the end of World War I, the men of Fray Bentos held a unique distinction. They were the most decorated tank crew of the entire war. The legacy of Fray Bentos is more than just a footnote in the history of armoured warfare. It's a testament to the bravery, endurance and ingenuity of the first generation of tank crews, men who fought not just against enemy fire, but against the very conditions of the battlefield itself. World War I was a proving ground for armoured warfare, and the lessons learned in battles like Passchendaele shaped the future of military strategy. The tank, once an experimental weapon, would go on to dominate battlefields for the next century, evolving into the backbone of modern mechanised warfare. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more gripping stories from military history, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And if you think this story deserves to be heard, share this video with fellow history buffs and tank enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is full of untold stories waiting to be discovered.